Hello, everybody. This is Brad Dyke saying hello to you all. We've got a couple of milestones we're crossing today. One of them is I'm 2 subscribers away from having 1,000 subscribers. I never knew that would happen. All I wanted to do is reach out and help fellow IT people who have not had access to the kind of training and exposure I've had. And it's neat. It's nice. It's not required, and I appreciate that wonderful feedback from people, and they're giving me good insights on new ideas. And of course, that's leading to this video. And that is, of course, if you guys like my videos, please select like and maybe even subscribe if you like. But it just makes me a better person as I try to learn what you would like to have training on. What we're doing today is we're in a multi-phase process of upgrading my data center. And remember, a data center is not a home lab rack setup. It's many servers working together in conjunction on enterprise platforms like HANA or Exchange email, or binds an SMTP with an application, or you're doing API work and stuff like that. So that makes it more inclusive as a data center. But to do that, you have multiple racks. And in my case, I have, if you look back in the background, a very ancient old AT&T Telcom rack that was 26 inches wide, but I converted it to a 19-inch footprint so that I could get away with what I needed to do. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do a quick review on the old rack to know what's going to go out the door and be retired, and what is coming in to replace it. As you can see, this rack is pretty old. I mean, it's really old. Matter of fact, it's older than probably many of you. This is an early 1970s style rack encasement designed to hold what's called telecom equipment, telecommunication baseline, TRIs, PRIs, T1s, and so on. And as you can see, the gap here, it's a wider rack than traditional today's style racks, and it has basically been modified. As you can see, my toolage, and basically making this into a functional set for a 19U style rack. It is big, it is bulky, it is very strong. I've been using it for a long time, and as you can see, I've modified this over the years. I've got wheels on the bottom, I've got parrot struts, I've got an umbilical set arm here for an LCD display, which is right here. And as you can see, it's just really been really heavily used over the years. And not only that, but if you go to the back, as you can see my trunk up there, coming down my fiber, my coaxial, my set, my Cat6, and so on. And it comes down here to do all my functional connectivity. I've got my old patch panel here. It's an old one. And I've got the back panel sectionals, and of course, so many different projects over the years that my wiring is basically in a more practical state, not necessarily in a highly organized state. The bad news about having a highly organized rack enclosure environment is that you don't want to modify it. I modify the heck out of mine like crazy. And up there is my Netgear Nighthawk. That's a great router capacity. But as you can see, the height, the size, the wear and tear, it's getting old. And it's time to phase it out. So the question is, what do I need to do that? Well, the first thing I need to do is identify that I have PDUs, one here and one over here. And these PDUs provide us the functional capacity of power, 2 separate brick circuits. In other words, I have basically a 20 amp, and down at the floor I have another 20 amp down there. And this is providing power distribution for this unit because I have miners in here, 4 miners to be exact, as you can see down here. So this guy draws 40 amps, and that's a lot of power for one rack. But with that being said, as you can see, it has some overhead to it. So the question is, what do I do, and what do I want to replace it with? Replacing this requires a couple of very significant things. One, what am I going to get rid of? What's going to be retired? What's going to transfer? And so on and so on. Now down here I have miners that I have decommissioned because Ethereum is no longer mineable. So I've taken them out and I'll rebuild them and maybe repurpose them down the road. Maybe just make one big GPU miner out of them and do something like that. And up here I've got my pfSense box, which is temporarily offline because I'm not doing infrastructure and VLAN testing and stuff like that. And then of course I have a very high-end 48 port 1 gigabit baseline stack switch, which is up here. It's a Netgear style switch, And of course, it's behind a non-routable network, so I'm not too worried about anybody knowing anything about it. So what am I going to bring over? Well, probably won't be bringing the umbilical arm over. I will be bringing over the keyboard tray over, but I might go to a reduced format keyboard just for a little bit more space and comfort. And or I may use what's called a spiral bat. A spiral bat is an interesting little device that can allow you to pull out a keyboard, mouse, work on it, and then tuck it away when you're not using it. It's a little difficult to work with, but I think it might be worthwhile to put in the rack enclosure. All the telecommunication baseline, the OBCL, DSNs, and of course the firewall routers setup and all of that will go over. So that's what I'm taking over. Probably these will stay in the basement for now until I get back to them and work them on a separate effort. But all in all, that's the goal. Now, where and what am I going to use to replace that? Well, let me show you. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we are going to show you something called a VEVOR. That's a VEVOR style 19-inch rack, 27U footprint in open rack design. Open rack design basically means that I have it set up so it's fully ventilated. There are no side panels, nothing like that. Basically so that I can keep maximum airflow. And that's very important when you're on the cheap end of running IT solutions, is, you know, you don't have the money there to keep everything nice and cool because you don't have an HVAC or a cooling system to do that. So basically, this is an okay design. If I had to give it a grade of 50% as failure and 100% as A plus, I would say probably an 80, more probably like a 75, and I'll explain why. To explain why, I'm going to show you what it looks like. Here you've got the rack. It's kind of sharp looking when you look at it. It has basically a wide expansion based chassis on the bottom, which is very important to do because it allows the rack from basically leaning forward or falling over or tipping over. It has three what they call universal slide receiver shelves, one in the bottom, one here, of course, and one here. Now, the bad news about this part is you cannot not have these. The structural integrity of this particular style of rack enclosure means basically that you have to understand that the thickness of the metal here is not rigid enough. In other words, it has some flexibility. And what I mean by flexibility is that here, I'll give you an example. See, I can wiggle it and it just back and forth. So without these structural rails, the integrity of the front and back rail are poor. But when you do add them, then you are okay to a degree. But if you put your foot down on the bottom here and you come up and you start lifting this and you just give it a little bit of a waggle, you got this very, what I call give, if you know what I mean. You can see the give. That's just me moving it back and forth. That's because of the rigidity. In other words, the strength of this metal is kind of weak. So that's okay. I mean, for $151, I can live with that. Why? Well, I'll give you an example why. Because if you look at the constructs here, in other words, how it's integratizing itself, it's doing it on the inside of the rail. Well, can I do that on the outside of the rail? Absolutely. You can actually set yourself up what we call cross beams. Take one here and drill a hole down here and set in a cross sectional that will go across, and it will create a little bit of resistance against the flexibility of the chassis. Now, another thing that which you can do, and I think this is a really great idea because of two reasons. One, it does not hold heat. That's key. This rack will hold heat because it's metal. Now, there's not a lot of metal, so that the ability to sustain and hold the heat is not high. That's great. So it's going to work in a fairly cool basement environment, and it will conduct the coolness of the basement. But if you put on top of it a plexiglass top like this, okay, this is a pre-cut. You can get this at Walmart, Lowe's, Menards, and you basically are going to put it on top, and you're going to screw mount the top piece into each of the areas. Now, what happens there is you no longer have a pitch variance when you move it forward or backwards. It actually becomes rigid. And as you can see, the thickness of this plastic is pretty significant. If I used a thinner plastic, it probably won't work as well. So I basically, in just putting a little bit, this is about $7 worth of plastic, putting it on top of this chassis, and it gives it literally about a 35% increase in strength, and that's it. A matter of fact, technically speaking, as long as you kept the bottom set of rails in place and you have the top piece, these two middle ones can come out completely and you could put something else out. Now, for those who are designers, they like to have all their space, especially if it's a 27U, which is what this is. As you can see, it's not nearly as high as the old rack, but it does need some TLC to make this rack optimal for what you want to do. Still consider the idea of putting exterior base-like crossbars if you want to, and you can use plastic for that. It's, you know, this plexiglass plastic is pretty resilient when it comes to being used for structural integrity. A matter of fact, one possibility you can do is just, once you put this on, put another piece that goes across here and just use these mounting holes, which are automatic, and you can use that to keep this in a very nice tight format. So with that being said, you know what, for $160, $170, this is going to work out pretty good. So as you can see here, as I've gone ahead and I've placed a Dell 610R 1U footprint in here, and it's just sitting on the universal shelf for now. This particular server is basically what we call the standard footprint server in the industry, what is known as an open form 1U chassis. Now the open form 1U chassis, as you can see, kind of comes out the back a little bit to a certain degree. Now this particular rack, I could have got one that is deeper, but I didn't want that because this rack isn't going to hold servers like this. It's actually going to hold telecom or telecommunications or redacted chassis footprints. In other words, small stuff, smaller stuff. So it'll have a patch panel potentially in the back of it here. It will have cabling guides and so on and so on. It will have what's called a half chassis, which you saw one of them, that PF Sense chassis, which only goes in about this far into the environment because it's all based on the back end of the interface. But all in all, the environment is pretty nice. Now the last little feature I think is valuable here, and it does become an issue when you're not thinking about it, and that is in regards to the fact of stationary locking. So down here on the bottom, as you can see, there are actual locks. These locks help you, but they're not a replacement for what's called an L-bar. An L-bar is pretty simple. Basically, it's just a 90-degree bar that's high enough to be able to be bolted to the sides of your rack, on the sides like you can see down here, and there are the holes for it, and it goes down to the floor and it presses on the floor to make sure that this rack will not tip over. And yes, it is very easy to tip over a rack, so you have to be very careful about how you go about doing the placement of your hardware. As you can see, this is a mid-tipped right now because it's got the weight in the tip, but if I put it up at the top, then it would become top heavy. So with that being said, this rack, once I put the pieces on to finalize it, will become the new telecom rack in my basement, and I'll retire the old one and scrap it out to give to probably a scrap yard because it's just too old to give it to somebody to use. It's just not good in that regard. But by doing that, my first stage is, of course, going in and making sure that I'm able to identify all the things that are going to come over, fit in this reduced format, and then come back together and provide me the connectivity I need provider-wise for what I'm trying to do. So this is Brad Dyke signing off. Have a blessed day, and keep enjoying what you do. Bye-bye.